Indigenous Earth Community Podcast, where we celebrate Indigenous heroes from around the world and learn from them on how to honor the traditions of protecting the planet. We discuss actionable tips on how to connect to our beautiful planet while lessening our daily impact. I'm your host, Frank Oscar Weaver. Hello everyone, I've had a great conversation with Neil Giardino, who is an American journalist, producer, and photographer currently based in South America. He just returned from a trip from my home country of Paraguay, where he did some reporting for indigenous communities who are fighting pig soy. Hey Neil, how are you?
Well, thank you, Frank. Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And you just came back from a trip to my home country of Paraguay. I have to know, how was your trip? What do you think of it?
Incredible. You know, in addition to spending a couple of weeks in Asunción, which was just a fascinating place, I got to travel to the far west in the Chaco region, the far east in the Región Oriental, and then I made a trip down to Encarnación in the south along the Argentine border. It was a fascinating trip. And I think far too short, actually. I could do another month.
I remember you telling me that there's a million stories that you could have told. So I'm excited to learn more about the stories that you decide to tell about Paraguay. And did you had a chance to drink some terere?
I did. My first or second day when I arrived, I didn't have my own thermos like all of the Paraguayans carry around. But I met a guy that was selling terere on the street. And he just grabbed a cold bottle of a plastic bottle of water and made me my terere to go. Very refreshing.
Yeah, it tastes so good. And for the people that haven't had a terere, it's just like, I'll say like a green tea. But in Paraguay, it's so hot that, you know, we drink it all the time because it's just so refreshing to drink it throughout the day. We drink it the hot version in the early mornings or even like in the evening. So yeah, it's so refreshing, and it has a little bit of caffeine, but there's no crash like coffee, and is the traditional beverage of Paraguay. So I'm really glad you got to try it out.
I was just going to say a quick tip on terere. I met a friend in Asunción who made me a terere with moringa, the moringa herb with orange peel, and it along with the yerba mate, and it was very, very good. So I'm sold on terere.
That's awesome. Yeah, in Paraguay, you know, when we are there in the indigenous communities, you know, before they start the terere, they would ask you, you know, how you feeling? You know, it's like, oh, maybe my stomach is upset. And they're like, okay, no problem. So they will go in the woods and they will maybe get like a vine they would match up and put in the terere for your stomach. So they use a lot of medicine herbs. I would say most Paraguayan have a really good knowledge of medicine herbs just from the terere.
Yeah, that was what actually surprised me, because when I was out on the street just drinking terere, a man came up to me as we were drinking, and he was just explaining all of the names of the herbs in Guarani. And he knew every one of them. And he was, you know, it was another just kind of fascinating kind of interaction in Paraguay, where you have a largely bilingual culture, right? Even if you have a European descended man in his 50s or 60s, you know, he's fluent in both Spanish and Guarani, which is just another element that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely a big part of our culture, speaking Guarani. And I remember when I was in high school, I think I was in 9th grade, is when they started teaching Guarani in schools. Before then, it was just, you know, Guarani was taught at home. You know, your grandma would speak it, your parents would speak it. But in the workplace, we would speak Spanish. But, you know, when I grade, they're like, you know what, we're going to start teaching Guarani in schools too. And you can see even like on the TV stations, like the reporting, they'll be speaking Spanish, they go to Guarani, and they go back and forth. It's really cool to see. And talking about reporting, on your trip in Paraguay, you did some really serious reporting about indigenous land evictions and contaminated communities. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So my visit to Paraguay in October coincided with a pretty inflammatory UN ruling, which landed in mid-October, which essentially blamed the Paraguayan government for violating the rights of the Ava Guarani tribe of Eastern Paraguay for allowing the use of banned pesticides in the adjacent soy monoculture farms nearby the community.
And there's a picture that you took that is just heartbreaking. And as someone that kind of seen a similar image, it just hit really close to home. And it's like an indigenous kid looking into the farmers using pesticides into the crops. Can you tell us more about that picture that you took?
Yeah, within an hour or two of arriving in the community. And, essentially when you arrive to this community, it's called Campo Agua A, and it is essentially a depleted island amid an entire sea of soy monoculture. I mean, just thousands of hectares of soy cultures all around this community. And this is ancestral land that these people have lived on for many, many, many years. So about an hour or so into my visit, they had been telling me about the soy contamination and the pesticides. And there it was, perfectly vindicated. Here was this massive tractor that was spraying pesticide. This was the reason why I was in this community, to document, the poisoning of this community, their land. They're being robbed of their culture. They're being robbed of their spiritual cosmovision. And so I immediately, it was such an iconic moment. I grabbed my camera and I just started taking a picture. One of the younger boys was naked and he's kind of, leaning into the shadow of his older sister. And they're both gazing out at this massive sea of soy as this fumigation tractor just sprays. And, the way that the young girl has her hand on her hip, it's sort of, she stands in defiance of it. It was an image that I was proud of, and also kind of to take a picture like that and to see this poisoning in real time in the community.
To say that the image is worth 1,000 words, and just looking at this image, it really reflects what's going on in Paraguay right now with indigenous communities losing the territorial ancestral land. And I'm so happy that you were able to go there and witness. And, you have written an article to Al Jazeera, and I'm going to go ahead and put the link on our show description so that way you can kind of read Neil's article and you can see the picture for yourself. And Neil, let me ask you something. I know that you have done more reporting across Latin America, also in Peru. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, sure. I started out reporting on, indigenous peoples of South America around 7 years ago or so. I first visited Guyana and did a story on the oil boom that's kind of been convulsing and thrilling and Guyanese for the last, 6 or 7 years with discovery of offshore oil there. So I kind of got my feet wet in Guyana and interviewed and did some reporting on some of the Arawak communities there. But before that, just came from a love of travel and experiencing different cultures in Latin America. And I guess a formative experience for me was just being, on a trip in my early 20s in Mexico and being in a market in Oaxaca in Western Mexico and just hearing indigenous languages and thinking, wow, I know that these cultures are alive and there's so much to learn. And it just started for me, like hearing that language and that, in a market in Oaxaca basically triggered this passion to sort of dig deeper and understand indigenous cultures in Latin America. And, from then I eventually made my way to South America, where I've been focusing a lot of my work, the most of my work on indigenous cultures and communities.
That's amazing that you're able to go to all these different places and tell stories that, in my opinion, are one of the biggest stories of our time. The defense of the Amazon, of our lungs, of the planet by indigenous people. Yeah. When you're there in the Amazon, I got to ask you, what's the favorite sound that you heard while you're there in the jungles?
I think for me, if you ever have the privilege or have had the privilege of spending a night in an indigenous community, it's just, these are cultures that celebrate life. Amid all of this horrific, hardship, I think that there's still very much a proud and celebratory people, a lot of these tribes that I visited. And so, I think one of the joys of being in an indigenous community is at night is just to sort of listen to maybe the last hours of a party. They drink traditional masato, which is cassava or fermented, and just as the chatter and the music and the festivities die, and then the jungle sort of overtakes everything, right? So you're hearing the frogs, you're hearing the cicadas, you're hearing this kind of chorus of nocturnal animals, and I would say that's just a powerful experience to hear the jungle at night.
Wow, yeah, that will be a great experience to see, the coexistence of, indigenous people with the nature around them. And I hope that, we are able to preserve that for future generations to be able to also experience those sounds. And, you're traveling in two worlds, from the United States to Latin America and doing reporting. What do you think that is something that people here in the U.S. have a hard time understanding about the situation at ground level in Latin America?
There are so many threats, there are myriad threats for indigenous peoples in South America and in the Amazon where I work and report. When we talk about, state institutions that should be protecting these vulnerable parts of the population, they just don't exist. There's no safety nets for these people. Not only do they live in remote, just powerfully remote parts of the globe, they're also, they lack proper sewage and plumbing. They lack medical clinics in their communities, and so there are these surface level threats is much more complicated threats. For instance, a lot of reporting on narco-trafficking in Peru's Amazon. And I recently spent some time in the Vraim, which is the valley of the Rio Apurimac, Ene, and Montaro. This is the region that's said to produce about a fifth of the global cocaine supply, and it all happens in this epically beautiful river valley. And you see when you land in this community that coca is everywhere, right? Coca is everywhere, and largely there are these sort of rural, semi-impoverished, mestizo cocaleros, these coca farmers. And, a lot of these communities in Peru, especially, the Asháninka, these ancestral tribes, they have thousands of hectares of land, which, a lot of it is totally threatened on all sides, right? From coca farmers, from land invasion, from illegal logging. And so I spent, about a few months ago in the Vraim of Peru, reporting on threats to this one tribe, the Asháninka. And I just think, once you land on the ground there and you talk to people and you hear their stories, which go back decades of trauma and violence from some subversive, fanatical political groups like the Sendero Luminoso, all the way to the present threat of narco-terrorism in that region. I think it's really important, and it's really unknown that it's so nuanced and complicated in that region that once we tend in the media to tell stories of good versus evil, black and white, right? But when you're on the ground there, what you realize is that it's so much more complicated. For instance, the Asháninka tribe in Peru, who live in the Selva Central region of Peru in the Amazon, dire hardship has forced some of these communities to rent their land to coca farmers, right? So while you might speak to someone on the ground and they'll tell you, well, we're anti-coca, we don't grow coca in this, and we're fighting the cocaleros. Well, you can go to another village and they're leasing their land to coca farmers, which are in turn selling those coca leaves on the black market to narco-traffickers and smuggling the pasta básica, that cocaine paste, through smuggling routes that are controlled by, narco-terrorists. So it's so complicated, and I think it involves a lot of delicacy and a lot of hard questions asked to really get beyond sort of staid kind of black and white narratives once you're on the ground.
Yeah, that's impressive, and I'm glad that you are able to articulate really well for our listeners on the reality of living as indigenous people in Latin America. That is very complicated. There's a lot of issues that they have to deal with, and I think you're a superb storyteller, and a lot of our audience are young people looking to maybe get into a career in storytelling and journalism. What would you say to advice for them as they start on that path?
I would just say to find a theme, find a topic, find a cause that thrills you and moves you, and just go with it. Because look, I'm a freelance journalist. I'm based in New York, and every year I take many months out of my life on my own to make these reporting trips into the Amazon, into South America, and often they last much longer than I intend them to. Right, so I'm going on like my 5th month here in South America, and I think I only intended to be gone for around 2 or 3 months. But my advice is to put a stranglehold on the topic that inspires you, and just absolutely attack it, and don't let up. And I promise that if you work hard enough, I know it sounds kind of cliche, but if you work hard enough, your passion will take you to places that you never expected them to. I mean, I never expected in my life to be, reporting on stories about isolated tribes, along the Peru-Brazil border. But, a few years ago, there I was on the borderlands of Madre de Dios, Peru, and Acre, Brazil. And we saw a group of isolated Mashco-Piro tribe members, right? This is a tribe that lives along the borderlands. They're still migratory. They've rejected contact with Peruvian national society, right? And I guess to answer your question in a roundabout way is I never in my life thought that I would be sort of on the precipice of that world, right? And having access to that world and speaking to experts about that world and grilling politicians about policy that is threatening those vulnerable communities. But like I said, if you dig your heels into something that you love, you will find that doors open. It might not yield high pay and, and glory, but satisfaction, yes. And cause, yes.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you encouraging the new wave of storytellers that are coming up. And, please follow Neil, and follow his reporting, because I think that you're doing such an important work that, we want to support you in all your writings and all the stories that you want to tell.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Of course.
I just wanted to follow up on the situation down in Paraguay. The story that I reported was on land eviction and contamination of pesticides on these soy crops. But, we're talking about a wave of land evictions in the last several months in eastern Paraguay. On the 18th of last month, there were 70 families evicted from an indigenous community in Caguazu department in eastern Paraguay. Just last week, 87 Ava Guarani families lost their homes in another community. And I think just yesterday, another campesino community was evicted from their home. So these are, these stories, I focus a lot of my reporting on narco-trafficking and threats to the Amazon. But when you talk about the unique threats that Paraguay's indigenous are facing, I mean, these are like powerful drug cartels, right? These soy companies are like mafias, right? And they have all of the resources to kick out indigenous communities from land that, they claim is ancestral. I reached out to many ministries in Paraguay to get the government's perspective on these land evictions and this contamination. And, hardly any government ministry responded to me. I was able to contact the police commissioner in one of the communities that was evicted forcefully. And, he told me there's video of this, and maybe you can post the video or something, but of, this community of Huguapoi. This is an Ava Guarani community that was evicted. There's women and children, women clutching their babies in fear. I asked the police chief, I said, why such force? They had anti-riot police. There were helicopters, Frank. And this is in a very rural area, right, of Paraguay. There's 70 families that are, largely unarmed. I mean, they have ancestral weapons in some cases as a show of force. But I asked him, why such a show of force on the police? And he told me, well, you know what? We had a judicial warrant to evict this community, and it's policy with our department to have double or triple the personnel in order to avoid violence. But, the video shows a different story. It shows a community terrified, being forced out of their community. And the claimants of the land are Mennonite soy farmers. So you can really get a sense of how these big industries act as mafias and really control, land claims. So it's a really, really concerning situation out in eastern Paraguay right now. And just final thought is that a lot of these institutions, are really, really weak. A lot of these indigenous institutions in Paraguay that should be representing tribes are really not doing their job. So these tribes are very vulnerable.
Yeah, it's such a complicated topic. And, I have spoken about my friend Osmar on the podcast before, and even to you, Neil, that, he's trying to start his own nonprofit that is run by Indigenous people, to help in these cases of land dispute and so much. And, I try to support him as much as I can, because we really need to fortify those organizations that are on the ground there fighting for Indigenous rights.
Right. And I don't know, Frank, do you know INDI? This is the National Institute of Paraguay's Indigenous. This is a state organization. I interviewed someone from a legal director of INDI, and, about these land evictions. And he told me that, while they're fighting hard for land claims for Indigenous of Paraguay, he said they are also representing the president of Paraguay, the leader of Paraguay, and they are, one of their jobs is to defend private property. So that goes to show you, this is the Indigenous organization of Paraguay that is actively siding with, land claims by soy monoculture farms. So with the story that really recently came out on Al Jazeera, a friend reached out to me on Instagram and, just said, like, how can I help? And I really had a hard time with that question, because I really don't know. In Peru, for instance, and in Amazon, there are a number of NGOs that advocate for tribes and reforestation and all sorts of social welfare programs, social programs. But I really, in this case, especially with soy and these evictions and this contamination in Paraguay, I really don't know. So maybe if you had any ideas or had any resources in the case of these evictions or contamination that you might want to share.
Yeah, for sure. I know some organizations that are working towards helping, towards evictions, but it is really grassroots that, they're not on social media, they don't speak English, they don't have a bank account you can do. But maybe that's something that, going forward, we can maybe build a coalition with those organizations and, help them to bring their stories into the forefront and have people here in the United States and also around the world to be able to support them. So that's definitely something that we have to look into it and see, how we can continue offering our support to those communities.
Awesome. Excellent, Frank.
And Neil, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate. I was so happy to have connected with you, and I'm glad to see all the reporting that you have done in the past. And I look for. Is there any more reporting coming out of
from me? Time will tell. As a freelancer, it's just always about these news pegs like what happened last week with the evictions and such. But I am reporting on. I also reported on the Far East in the Chaco with the Nivakle tribe on the severe drought that's hitting that region. So maybe look out for another piece on Paraguay in the coming.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm going to add your contact information so people can follow you on social media. And Neil,
okay, great.
Thank you much for your time again. I really appreciate it. I was very eye-opening conversation. I'm from Paraguay, and even from being there, I was aware of everything that was going on. And people like yourself that is out there reporting, it really makes a difference to get the stories out. So thank you.
Thank you so much for all your help, Frank, navigating Paraguay. You were a great help to me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be able to help a little bit. And I look forward to talking to you soon.
Okay, sounds good.